and welcome to this week's episode of Half Court Press. He's Wilson Moore. I'm John Walker, and we're on Zoom because one of us is camped in Lincoln, and the other, selfishly, I'm getting ready to go to New York and for a conference tournament, and so it'll be fun, and it'll be a little different this week. Again, we're on Zoom instead of the studio. We'll get that, I think, fixed next week maybe. But who knows? Because it's going to be pretty hectic from here on out. But Wilson, we found out a lot about both of these teams this week, especially
He
one.
most certainly did.
Well, yeah, especially one more than the other. And let's just start there, because the biggest thing we learned is that Nebraska season is over, and unless maybe there's a trip to the Crown.
The Crown, yeah. Fred Hoiberg has said a couple times that Nebraska plans to is anticipating playing in some sort of postseason tournament. I would imagine. I know there are there's some like Crown bracketology out there. Even my sick mind hasn't taken the plunge into that yet. But from every indication I've got, Nebraska's season will continue in a very anticlimactic way, likely in the Crown.
Right. But yeah. Not that their season's over. I guess that wasn't correct, but their NCAA tournament,
the meaningful part of their season is over. Like, as
cynical
as that's going to sound, not to disrespect the hallowed tradition of the Crown.
Hey, they could make history this season, because they could be the final Diamond Head Classic champions, and perhaps the inaugural College Crown champions.
Who knows? If they won the Crown, and we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves here, but if they were to win the Crown, I think in all likelihood Bryce Williams would probably be the MVP of the tournament. It's hard to picture them winning that tournament without him playing well. So if that happened, Bryce Williams in his college career would have a CBI MVP, a Diamond Head Classic MVP, and the Crown of college basketball MVP. He would be one of the greatest MTE players of all time.
Yeah, he sure would. And he was one of the best players in the Big Ten this year.
He was.
You've kind of been on that for a while, but for Nebraska finishing 15th in the Big Ten and missing the conference tournament, for Bryce Williams to make first team all Big Ten is really, really impressive. Like Micah Peavy, for example, plays for Georgetown. They finished 7th in the Big East, obviously not as deep of a league. And he was on first team, and people were like, why? You can't put a guy in from the 7th place team on all Big East first team. And that's what happened with Bryce Williams in Nebraska. But as good as he was all year, Wilson, it wasn't enough. And even he was not enough Sunday in, kind of the final nail in the Huskers' coffin for their NCAA tournament hopes. 83-68 loss to Iowa, capped by a couple of pretty emotional scenes in Pinnacle Bank Arena.
Yeah, it's hard to describe just like what happened, just because it was just two teams that in some ways had a lot to play for, and in other ways were just kind of sleepwalking to the end of the season. And Nebraska just for the last probably 35 minutes of that game, Nebraska was just kind of lifeless. Nebraska was flat. The Pinnacle Bank Arena crowd was just kind of numb, I thought, the entire game. It never really got fully engaged, which is not entirely its fault, because Nebraska didn't give it a whole lot of reason to be engaged either. It was just kind of a weird day. It started at 11:30. It was just the vibes all day were just kind of strange, and a Nebraska team that we have seen at its best moments in that building and its worst moments just was not all the way there. They just kind of, like I said, sleepwalked through the game. It felt like Jawan Gary was the only one who making who like you noticed when you watched, like he was the guy doing what he's done for his entire career and what made him a fan favorite at Nebraska and why he's so respected by his opponents, which you saw at the end of that game. He was the guy crashing the offensive glass and trying to go up and over dudes and just, trying to will Nebraska into something that day. And it just, but he was the only kind of, this is going to sound like a weird metaphor, but the only jagged edge in an otherwise flat, performance. Iowa did a very good job on Bryce Williams. They held him to 7 points. That was his lowest of the season. They were blitzing him off of ball screens. They were just doing everything they could to make someone else beat them. And with the exception of Gary, no one else did. Connor Esijan was, I think, 0 for the field. Nebraska just didn't get much production. It felt like Iowa just made more plays. Iowa did some nice things on offense, getting the ball in the middle, spraying out. They shot, I think, 40-something% on threes. It felt like Iowa dictated every part of that game. And when it comes down to it for Nebraska, that wasn't a performance. And I've said this about quite a few of their games. That wasn't a performance worthy of making the NCAA tournament or even the Big Ten tournament. And it's crazy that the NCAA tournament, and this speaks to how deep the Big Ten was and just the general weirdness of this year, that up until the final buzzer sounded, the NCAA tournament was still very much on the table for Nebraska. They needed to win that game. They needed to win probably 2 in Indianapolis, which was that likely given the way the Huskers were playing? No. But was it possible? No question. So just a weird day when there was quite a bit at stake for Nebraska and the Huskers just didn't really meet the moment.
And I wonder, Wilson, obviously this is something you'd never admit if you were in the program, obviously, but I wonder how deflated they were from what had happened literally days earlier and what had happened over the last couple of weeks. Because of course, they knew that they were going to have to if they lost 5 straight to close the regular season. If you win one of those, you're in the Big Ten tournament.
Yeah.
That's kind of the thing. And they lost 3 straight by a combined 7 points.
Yeah.
And it all started with that blowout loss at Penn State. And then they played Michigan in PBA, lost to Minnesota in PBA, went on the road, had a chance at Ohio State, had quite a few chances at Ohio State, and lost in double overtime. And that has to catch up to you at one point, no matter how urgent you need to be. That at some point has to catch up to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've got a story kind of about this dropping tomorrow. That's the premise of the story is the 3 plays that kept Nebraska out of the Big Ten tournament, but probably the NCAA tournament as well. And that's Connor Esijan's missed 3 at the end of the Michigan game, Brennan Rigsby at the end of the Minnesota game, and spin the wheel, take your pick for any of the 9 things that could have gone differently in that Ohio State game. It's the margin for error for Nebraska this season was so slim. The Huskers played in 9 games that either went into overtime or were determined by 5 or fewer points, and they went 2-7. And it's one of those things.
Tough.
Well, it is tough. It's A, you got to close games, and B, you can drive yourself crazy. Thinking about those 3 plays, and their plays in the USC and the Rutgers game that all of those that just you think if there are 5 of those and if 2 of those go differently, how different is the complexion of the season? And one more thing on this topic that I think was interesting that I think kind of explains a lot about this Nebraska season is Nebraska was in consideration to make the NCAA tournament because they beat some very good teams this year. Especially in Big Ten play, UCLA, Oregon, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio State, all possibly going to the NCAA tournament, and Nebraska beat all of them, and that's why Nebraska was a potential NCAA tournament team. The flip side of that is that Nebraska lost to a lot of bad teams, and that was really bad news for a team trying to make the Big Ten tournament, because that meant all of these teams at the bottom of the Big Ten had the tiebreaker on Nebraska. Nebraska finished one game behind Rutgers, who beat them in January. They finished tied with Iowa, Northwestern, USC, and Minnesota. That's 4 teams, none of whom were particularly good this year, and three of them beat Nebraska. So you say, like, how was Nebraska close to making the NCAA tournament but didn't make the Big Ten tournament? They lost to all these teams and screwed themselves in terms of tiebreakers. And, it's just, I have overused the word weird on this season, and I don't know, in the past 10 minutes, but it was just an utterly bizarre season for Nebraska.
Yeah, no, that's for damn sure. Because like they kind of had success early in the season. We've talked about this the past couple of years. They do not play a daunting non-con schedule. No. Like, they're going to play Creighton, and that's always a marquee opportunity. And then they usually schedule one other tough one. This year it was St. Mary's, and they beat Creighton. And it was like, okay, like they've got a recipe, and then they followed that recipe, just that hard-nosed defense, scored just enough buckets to get by. And I really feel like everything changed with that blowout at Purdue.
Yeah, I mean that's what I don't know. I'm going to go one game earlier than you on this one and say everything changed when they blew a 15-point second half lead to Iowa. Yeah. I mean, at that point, and maybe it's dumb to, we do know if they win that game, they're in the Big Ten tournament because they finished one game outside of it. Yeah. But you think about, like, if they, like, at that point, you hang on to a 15-point second half lead, you're 3-1 in Big Ten play with a win over UCLA and a road win in your pocket. Like, that's huge. But who knows? We saw 2 very distinct versions of Nebraska show up this season and flip a coin who was going to show up on a given night. So maybe it's a pointless exercise to go back and say, like, who does this if something happens. But yeah, I think we can agree it was sometime in that area that they just, the cracks started to show up in this team.
Yeah, I think so. And ironically, right around that time is when Creighton started to piece itself back together. Because now the Jays are headed to the Big East tournament as the number 2 seed. They entered Saturday's regular season finale with Butler, able to control their own destiny. If they won, they were the 2 seed. If they lost, some other stuff had to happen, but they could fall to the 3. And they would prefer to not play Villanova. I do know that. And so they'd much rather play Georgetown, much rather play DePaul, because DePaul has beat Georgetown both times this season. So it's not really a foregone conclusion that they're going to play Georgetown in the quarterfinals on Thursday. So we'll see what happens in that front. But regardless, they're headed to the Big East tournament as the 2 seed. And Wilson, I know the Big East was down this year. Its floor was better, but there were a lot more like mid teams. And Creighton still compiled a Big East record of 15-5. That is the program's most Big East wins since joining the league 12 years ago.
Yeah, and I know we've talked about
this team to do that. Like that's nuts to me.
The team that lost Pop Isaacs 6 games into the season, and
like 9 games in, yeah.
And just a team that it felt like nothing was going according to plan about a month into that season. That is that's a remarkable turnaround and a pretty impressive job by Greg McDermott to get that figured out.
Yeah, we've talked about it a little bit, not recording, that if Rick Pitino had not resurrected St. John's in such a resounding way, that Greg McDermott would probably be the Big East Coach of the Year because of that. Like they lost Pop Isaacs. I don't know, I think a little less than 2 weeks before conference play started, and they slowly but surely pieced themselves together and and found a way to somehow win 15 games in that league. Large part of that was the 9-game winning streak, obviously, but that kind of leads me into the fact that this team would not be anything, anything remotely close to what it is, has been, will be moving forward in March, if not for Stephen Ashworth and Ryan Kalkbrenner.